Court is now resumed. You may be seated.
Whenever you're ready, sir.
We're now going to turn to topic. We're going to look at net crown resource revenues and detailed analysis of expense. I believe starting that over at slide.
Yes, slide 122 summarizes what I'm going to go through. Excuse me.
So give us an overview first.
Sure.
And then we'll get into the weeds, down the rabbit hole, or however you want to put it. But you do have to take the time to really explain that. Take your time and don't. Take the time you need to.
Okay. So I'm going to talk now, having laid out some of the general principles of identifying expenses and how we have to think about things like cost allocation, and march through the analysis. I'll start by talking about the data sources, where I'm able to get data on expenses the Crown incurred. I'm going to talk about the work in kind of three time periods: 1850 to 97, 1898 to 1945, and then after 1945. There are then a couple of other more detailed points to get into. So between 1897 and 1898, I want to talk about considering transportation expenses in the analysis. This is one of those key areas of disagreement I noted up front.
When you say between 97 and 98, you don't mean something happened
Oh, no.
during that year. You're saying in between your discussion about those different time periods, you want to talk about transportation expense.
That's correct. The expenses were not just incurred between 1897 and 1898. They start in the 1850s and kind of encompass both areas. So that's a logical place to talk about it. Then when we get into the details of 1898 to 1945, I want to talk about the attribution of partially included expenses or partially relevant things. So this is the overhead we were talking about earlier. There are a couple of other examples: surveys, land, air service, that serve multiple purposes and needs to be considered when we come to allocating, because in our factory example, it's a cost that addresses many factories. I'll then talk a little bit about the geographic allocation of expenses, and then I will go on a detailed walkthrough for a few years worth of the public accounts data to go kind of line by line how we include them. Thank you. The detail there's a number of them, but in so doing, I'll both talk about what I did and try to highlight some of the minor areas of disagreement and the couple of major ones between myself and Professors Bodway and Smart. So try as best I can to get two birds with the one stone in going through that detailed march through.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. And then I'll end with my methodology after 1945, which, as I've mentioned earlier, based on the level of aggregation in the data, in my opinion, the lack of ability to reliably attribute or allocate expenses to the direct Crown resource revenues, why I take another approach.
And just a reminder, all of these numbers go up to 2019. Can you just clarify that for us? Why only to 2019?
Well, when we started our work, the public accounts were only available until 2019, sometime in 2020. And so setting down this path, that was kind of when we started the analysis. We could go back and add an extra year or two, but Ontario continues to publish the accounts as time goes on, but that's the only reason it stopped.
So all the experts have taken their figures up to 2019 and then brought them forward to March 2020. So everyone's consistent that way.
That's right.
With different bring forward ways, but we're on the right month in the right year.
Right. And that's just a function, I think, of the data available when we started this endeavor.
Okay.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, no worries. Okay, so maybe if we go to the next slide, this is slide 123. Talk about 3 time periods, and we'll go through each of these in a bit more detail. 1850 to 97, 1898 to 1945, and then after 1945. So let's get started. So 1850 to 1897, we again have the benefit of the papers collected for the arbitration proceeding. Here on slide 125 is a snapshot of one of those tables. We know it's the screenshot, and we know it's the statement for the Robinson Superior because you can see on the top there it says west of Batchewana, which means we're dealing with Robinson Superior. This is an example of what we're dealing with. Slide 126 is
Just before you go to, can you just go back to 125?
sure.
If you look at the screenshot for statement for RST, it says in the second line there, and of all expenditures made thereon 1850 to 1892 inclusive. But you use it till 1897. Can you explain the difference in those dates?
There's another table that looks like this that covers the other years. I only showed you one as an example here.
Right, okay,
But
thank you.
It has another similarly unintelligible file name, but it's in the documents considered at the bottom there.
Right. So the bottom line is you do have data to 1897 from the Irving papers.
That's correct.
Thank you.
So this is just how we put that into these different columns based on the handwritten data. This is showing 1850 to 75.
This being
The
slide 126.
Slide 126. There's other years. Again, I just didn't show them for readability on the slide. And there are 11 categories of expenses. And I'll talk about each of those in more detail on the next slide where we can make the font a little larger. So there are, as I say, 11 expenditure items recorded here. These papers also record the revenue items. That's where we got the revenue for 1850 to 97. There's no disagreement there about those numbers, but I'm going to focus here on the expenses. So there are 11 surveys, colonization roads, land agent salaries.
Sorry, you're reading
Oh, I'm
from,
reading from slide 127.
thank you.
It's just a larger font of what was the heading of 126.
Thank you.
Land agent salaries, protecting timber and collecting ground rent bonuses and timber dues. They later have a different name of fire ranging, wood ranging, timber agent salaries, and contingency. That's all related to forestry. Departmental expense of collections, refunds, payments to Indians, and that is the $2,000 per year fixed annuity that's recorded in every year here. Public works, administration of justice, railway aid, and education. These are 11 categories. And again, the exercise becomes which of those are fully relevant, which of those are not relevant, and which of those are kind of partially relevant, that we might want to include some of those expenses. And on the next slide, 128, here's where I've arrived from reviewing these data. Relevant, so included in full, are the department expense of collections. That's very clearly related to collecting the revenues, the expense of the department for collections, and refunds, which can be, again, adjustments for too much revenue collected in the past. So,
And these collections can be any of those items that you identified earlier.
that's correct. So some of the categories included in the Irving papers for revenues are, collections from mining lands, collection from crown lands, ground rent related to timber. There's a whole category.
Yes, thank you.
And then I say potentially relevant. So we need to consider whether or not to include the next three. The first is surveys. So surveys, the cost of surveys are important if you're going to sell land, right? Or give someone the right to harvest trees on a given timber tract. The Crown has to know, or a landowner has to know, well, what land is that? That we all have to be in agreement over what land you're selling, what land you have the right to harvest. Otherwise, it'd be difficult to collect at the end of the day. So surveys are relevant in that sense. But, and related, and by relevant, I mean related to a direct Crown resource revenue, because you survey the land to then sell it or have someone harvest revenue, resources. But also included in surveys are surveys of lands that will be given away under the free grant lands I talked about earlier, either for settlers or for veterans, different programs that existed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to encourage settlement. So surveying those lands is necessary for, I guess, alienating those lands, but there's no revenue to be supported there. Now, I say in the parentheses, I conservatively include these in full because I don't think in this period of time there's sufficient data to allocate it in a reliable way. So you can think of surveys, if they're the head office, in my example, they're supporting sales of land, the timber tracts and other resource lands that are being sold and leased out, licensed, and the lands given away. In a perfect world, I'd be able to allocate some of those expenses to the lands given away and deduct those because that portion isn't supporting a direct Crown resource revenue. I can't, so I include it all to be conservative. Relatedly, are land agent salaries. So again, these would be agents of the Crown helping with the alienation of land. Given land agents and timber agents are reported separately, I do allocate land agent salaries basically based on the proportion of the acres of land that were sold versus granted free in the RST. So earlier, we were looking at some snapshots of land by township, and I pointed out it was other than free grant land. There are similar tables that have the free grants, so I can look at the ratio.
Are the land agents the ones who organize for something to be surveyed or organize for the transfer, free or by sale?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And so I allocate 49.9% of the land agent salaries because in the period of time where that data is available about acres granted free and acres sold, 49.9% was sold. Now for fire ranging, wood ranging, timber agent salaries and contingencies, much of that will be related to keeping up on the timber stocks. Now, I have a disagreement with Professors Bodway and Smart on the relevance of fire ranging. In my opinion, and we'll get into this in more detail later, fire ranging is one of those activities undertaken for multiple purposes. Part of it is to protect commercial timber stocks. Part of it is to protect communities and people. Again, in this period of time, I don't think there's a reliable way to allocate between those objectives. And so I include it all, even though in all likelihood, some portion of that expense, was related to making sure someone's house didn't burn down. But I include it all in this period. And then getting to the categories of expenses that in my opinion are irrelevant, we have education. That's kind of a general service. It's not tied to any revenues. We don't charge for education, and it's not related to resources. The administration of justice, public works, and I should note when it comes to public works, there were some other companion papers in these archival documents that talk about some examples of public works. I cite those in my report. It includes things like a jail, so not related to generating direct Crown resource revenues. I exclude the annuity payments, what's in the documents called the payments to Indians, because that's unrelated to the direct Crown resource revenues.
I'm going to stop you there, but
Sure.
in the final calculation of your net Crown resource revenues, how does the payments over the years come into, oh, sorry, maybe I should rephrase it. How does the payments to the Anishinaabe that were in fact made according to Canada's records from 1850 to 2019 factor into the overall picture here, if they don't come into account, in your view, as a proper Crown expense?
Sure. So they don't enter into in any year my calculation of net Crown resource revenues. I calculate those separate from the annuities actually paid. I provide some calculations in my report based on the data provided by Canada about what the difference between those two numbers is. But in all the numbers I'm talking about here, I'm just talking about the net Crown resource revenues before there's any sharing, if you will.
And the answer to Mr. Schachter's question is, in addition, then you use them as you use them in a calculation on what may be owing,
Right.
but not as an expense on NCRRs.
That's correct.
And the Crown's experts agree with you on that.
Yes, they also calculate NCRRs without this, and I think we both provide separate sets of calculations where we say, here was the total amount of NCRRs, however we each might calculate them, and here's the amounts that were actually paid. And the last two items that I exclude on this slide are colonization roads. As the name suggests, these were roads built for the purposes of settling and colonizing the area. Large part of these roads were to help facilitate the giving away of land through the different free grant acts. And again, these roads aren't supporting or calculating, collecting or regulating any direct Crown resource revenue. They're helping to effectuate the giving away of land. So I don't include them. And on that, I do have it's another point of disagreement between myself and the Crown's expert.
It wouldn't be solely for giving away land, though. It's giving away and selling.
Yeah. And so, and the last item,
Sorry.
Railway aid.
Sorry, Justice just asked you that the roads are for the purpose of selling lands?
They're for the purpose of providing access. The main purpose is to facilitate the giving away of land. The lion's
Main
share of land is
purpose?
given away.
It's really begging the question of if the main purpose is giving away the land, what are the other purposes in your view? And I believe you have some slides coming up on
Yeah,
this.
I'll talk about this
Okay.
in a little bit. Again, there's no fee for the use of the roads, and perhaps where this is leading is when I get to the rents calculation, where I'm valuing the land, I do include a portion of the colonization road expenses.
Okay.
Then the last item is railway aid. The last item is railway aid, which I also exclude because the railways, the Crown isn't getting a direct revenue from the railways in this period.
And do you have some slides on that later
I
as
do.
well?
I'll get into transportation in more detail.
Okay, so if we flip over to slide 129, I think this is where is a good summary that you prepared of where there's agreement and disagreement.
Yes, so this is a slide that goes through for these 11 items, my treatment and Professors Bodway and Smart's treatment. And included in the far right column is the total nominal amount from 1850 to 97, which is the period of that we have these detailed documents. And as you can see, we agree on most items. Those are the ones highlighted in blue. Whether we both include or both exclude, they're in blue. There are two that we disagree on relatedly, which is colonization roads and railway aid. And then I've highlighted land agent salaries in a kind of light blue or teal color, because we agree they're relevant. We just disagree about how relevant they are. They fully include them, whereas I include the 49.9% based on the proportion of land sold versus granted free.
Now, I just want to take you, before we leave this slide, to the issue of surveys.
Yes,
The previous slide said you included them conservatively completely.
yes,
And this chart on table 129 says you included them.
yes.
But I thought that there's been some concern raised that you didn't include them in Bodway and Smart's report.
Oh, yes. In their SIR reply report, they make a statement that I don't include surveys.
So any comment on that, or did you try and decide, could you figure out why they said that?
No, that statement is not correct.
Can I just ask you one question, please, going back to 128? You have talked and referred throughout to expenses that are relevant, not relevant, or partially relevant.
Yes.
And then on page 128, you have relevant, irrelevant, and potentially relevant. Is potentially different than partial,
Oh,
or
so of
you're
those
still
three-
thinking about it?
No, sorry, no, sorry. Of those three, the first and third are relevant, and the second one is partially relevant. I think this was just a helpful, yeah, I say potentially relevant. Surveys are partially relevant for the reasons I discussed, but I
Yes.
include them all, so I treat them as fully relevant. Land agent salaries are partially relevant, and I'm able to separate the part.
On a proportional
proportional
basis.
basis, yeah.
So
And-
first you have to figure out if it's potentially relevant. You have to figure out whether it's relevant or not first.
Mhm.
And then you have to decide if it is relevant, and if so, how much of it is
That's
relevant.
correct. So you're right, this is a little confusing with the potential and partial. I meant the potential more as a jumping off point to have a discussion about how I thought about these.
Okay,
But in that fully relevant and partially relevant framework, land agent salaries end up in the partially relevant. Thank you.
So I think, are we next ready for the
130.
slide after 129? So we go to NCRR expenses. Now you're going to get into transportation expenses and explain the disagreement about transportation, I think.
Yes. So as I noted on the prior slide, this is the main area. This is slide 131 we're on now. The main area of disagreement from a quantitative sense between myself and Professors Bodway and Smart is transportation, both railways and colonization roads. And in fact, that difference remains the main difference in the next period of time as well, 1898 to 1945. So I want to spend a little bit more time explaining why, in my view, railway subsidies, railway aid, colonization roads are not relevant Crown expenses for purposes of calculating net Crown resource-based revenues.
So
One thing I would,
yes, go ahead.
I'm going to say, I have a note here. We're focusing on colonization roads because every now and then the Crown does build resource-specific roads. So you'll see in the public accounts, starting in the 1890s through the early 1900s, there were mining roads. Those expenses I do include. Those are expenses for the purpose of building roads to exploit mining, as do Professors Bodway and Smart. I'm not saying all transportation infrastructure is irrelevant. I'm saying the general purpose transportation infrastructure serves a number of purposes not related to direct Crown resource revenues. So I think this slide, 132, kind of shows the math, if you will, of why transportation expenses are the main difference between my results and Professors Bodway and Smart's in this period. So looking left to right, the first column is my estimate of net Crown resource revenues. The second is their estimate of net Crown resource revenues. And the third column is the difference. Okay, so we differ, and these is in millions of dollars. So we differ by about $190,000, 1850 to 1897. And of that, approximately $150,000 is their transportation expenses. That's the second to last column. So in that first 48-year period, 82% of the difference is about our treatment of transportation. Looking at the next roughly 50 years, my estimate of net Crown resource revenues is 11.3 million. Their estimate is 2.4 million. The difference is 8.9 million. And of that difference, 4.2 million is transportation, or about 47%.
The 4.2 is really 4.15, yeah, on the chart
Yes,
here.
Yes. 47%. So again, this is one decision that has a large impact. We'll talk later how there's a number of smaller differences that have a smaller impact, but given this, I wanted to have a more fulsome discussion about transportation.
And so the two of them totaled up to $4 and, sorry,
Sorry.
$4.3 million.
Yes, if you look at the whole 96-year period, we have a difference of 9.07 million, 4.3 million of that is transportation. So it's 47% of this whole period as well. Okay. So why do I exclude railway aid and colonization roads? It comes back to that equation that I like of the three different reasons why the Crown might do something: direct Crown resource revenues, indirect Crown revenues, and other objectives of the Crown. And expenses support all of those things. And the question is really, either which is the predominant one or which is the one driving it. And if we're only measuring a certain benefit, here, direct Crown resource revenues, is it appropriate to include some or all of those costs on the other side of the ledger? So, and that's kind of what I'm stating here. You have to come back to that question that I talked about just before lunch. How does this expense relate to the relevant revenues included in the NCRR calculation? So if we think about the panoply of benefits that come from railroad construction, there's a lot that are not in direct net Crown resource revenues. Sorry, I'm on slide 134 now. There can be additional jobs in upstream industries, which contribute to GDP, we talked about earlier, other employment, non-economic goals, and indirect tax revenues. This would be from sales taxes, income tax. These are, what Professor Mintz and Mr. O'Riordan spoke about when they say apparently negative revenues can be explained by other tax revenues and other well-being or prosperity, I think is the word. In addition, the railroad companies themselves will pay taxes at some point, sometimes meaningful amounts of taxes. There are jobs created on the railroad companies. There can be other benefits to suppliers of railroad products. Those are not captured in our direct NCRR calculation. Then there are downstream jobs and tax revenues as well. So additional manufacturing, etc. Each of these can provide benefits. Those benefits can be both indirect Crown revenues and the general prosperity of society. So, but none of those are captured in our measure of direct Crown revenues. So when we're doing that netting out we talked about earlier, there'll be an imbalance if we include all of these costs, but only some benefits. This is an example, I think on the next slide, I mentioned taxes. This is something I discussed in my reply report. This is a snapshot of income taxes paid by railroads. You can see in Ontario from 1977 to 1981, the number was between 24 and 55 million per year. So those are not direct Crown resource revenues that are not included in either set of calculations, but are a benefit. I mean, this is money going directly to the Crown.
So now maybe, I guess my
Yeah, so-
question is, I'm looking at the next slide,
Sure.
slide 136, and the question I was going to ask, which kind of is just hanging there, is where in your calculation, if at all, are the fees and charges that the railroad pays to go across the land? Is there any of that in your calculations?
No, there's no calculation of any fees the railroad companies might have paid the landowner for use of the land. In part because there was no fee paid, they were given a right of way and given subsidies. It's a good question though, because sitting back, you might think if I'm a railroad company and I want to connect, say, Toronto and Winnipeg, the easiest way to go is going to be to build through the RST. And a landowner of the RST might say, oh, I should get some of that. It's valuable for you to use my land. If you have a plot of land and I want to build across it, you're going to say, give me something. It's valuable to you. So that didn't happen here. In fact, we just see the subsidy. This is an example of what Professor Stiglitz called last week a tax expenditure. So I'm on slide 136. That, at the end of the day, the Crown can decide, because it's balancing that big equation with the direct benefits, the indirect benefits, the other social objectives, it's worth spending this money. To balance that out, you want a railway. And you could either first charge, for the use of accessing the land, say to charge the railroads, oh, you want a right of way across RST that's worth X dollars, and then turn around and separately subsidize them to the tune of Y minus X dollars. Okay. And that would lead us to the subsidies we observe. Or you can do what was done here and not charge, so generate no revenues and incur a small subsidy. This was, I think, Professor Stiglitz's example with the electric car. You can lower the price or give a tax credit. On net, the Crown is indifferent, but when we look at measuring revenues, it makes a difference. So there are no revenues to offset here because they simply weren't charged, but they could have achieved that with different subsidy rates.
And just to be clear, in your calculation of revenues, you don't impute or pretend that the Crown received any income from the railways, do you?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
In your calculation of what counts as revenues, you've told us there were none, but you don't impute or pretend that there were some in your NCRR calculation.
So two things. I said there were no direct Crown revenues. As we saw on the previous slide, there are indirect Crown revenues, the income taxes. But I don't allocate the indirect ones, and I don't impute any direct costs or any direct revenues, rather, that you might expect a railroad company to pay for the use of the land. And sum total of all that is given the disproportionate scope of these other benefits and either actual revenues in the form of indirect Crown revenues or potential revenues not calculated, there's a lot of other benefits there and no direct revenues to count. I don't include the costs. In an allocation exercise, it's all ending up with the other factories that I'm not including.
Did you want to turn now to 1898 to 1945, which is the second big time tranche?
Sure. So after 1898, or starting in 1898, we have a similar data availability issue as we had with revenue after 1898, which is nothing specific to RST. So we're back to dealing with Ontario-wide data and how to first attribute that to the revenues I've talked about, and then how to allocate it to RST. So, we can imagine we can get those total Crown resource-based expenses, the big gray box, from the public accounts, and then go through an analysis of which are relevant, which are not relevant, and which are partially relevant. And before going through the line items, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I treat some of those partially relevant expenses, if that's okay. We talked a little bit about land agent salaries in the period 1850 to 98. There are other examples like that. might be helpful to talk about first. So how do we think about overhead expenses?
So
This
you're
is-
looking at slide 139.
Exactly, slide 139. In a lot of ways, the ministries and departments are set up similar to private companies with multinationals. There's a head office, maybe down in Toronto, and then you may have different branches or programs. At the branch or program level, we might be able to say which are relevant and which are not. But we really have no basis on which to allocate those salaries and contingencies. I mean, some years the minister's salary even shows up in the public accounts, on an Ontario-wide basis. So this is a kind of classic overhead example, as I was talking about earlier. If we were valuing a business in an office building, you'd want to allocate that lease to all the different floors. So the way to look at that is I say, and Professors Bodway and Smart take a similar approach. I don't want to suggest there's a big difference here. Of those expenses that are relevant and not relevant, and those that are overheads, you kind of have to treat it in almost three buckets. Okay. And we say the relevant share of overhead expenses to include is the fraction of the relevant non-overhead expenses divided by all of the non-overhead expenses. So let me give you an example. Suppose we had $100,000 in department head office costs, and we had $1 million in forestry related expenses and $500,000 in parks related expenses. We all agree forestry is relevant, parks is not. So of that non-overhead, there'd be 1.5 million. You say 1 million is relevant, 1 million divided by 1,500,000 is 2/3. So I then take 2/3 of the overhead expenses from the head office.
Okay, can
Sure.
you do that again?
Sure.
The relevant in this equation is
1 million,
the 1 million because it's from forestry.
yes.
Okay,
And the total is 1,500,000, which is that relevant amount plus the not relevant amount, the 500,000 that went to parks. That makes
where's the non-relevant on this
Oh, so,
fraction?
sorry.
Is
In
it
the total is relevant plus non-relevant.
Ah,
My bad.
no problem.
But the parks is non-relevant. All the experts agree that expenses in relation to parks is not relevant.
That's correct.
Got it.
That's why I use this example. I wanted to minimize.
Yeah.
So we have 1 million over 1,500,000.
Yep.
Is 2/3. And so you multiply that times the head office expenses of $100,000. And so I would then include, so that's 67,000. Should have picked something with better fractions. And so I then end up with 1,067,000 as relevant. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Okay. Great.
Now, so this
one
is-
other foot.
This is how you treat overhead expenses. From your understanding of Bodway and Smart, do they do it differently?
No, methodologically, we approach it the same way. We have a slight difference, and this is what's meant by the last bullet here. Where possible, I look at the department and then the individual branch levels. There can be overhead at both. So my example, this would be like the international headquarters and then the Canada headquarters. They just look at the department level overhead. So we'll see that in a little bit when I go through the slides line by line. But methodologically, we agree that this is the way to treat overhead expenses. I just don't recall the numbers they used in their example of forestry and parks, but similar.
Right.
Okay, so now I
We're
want
at
to talk.
slide 140 then?
Yeah, slide 140, 1898 to 1945. What are some of the other partially included expenses? So again, when it comes to land expenses, not related to surveys, again, this might be your land agent salaries and other cost of administering the Crown Lands branch. I again allocate expenses on the basis of acres of land sold or leased relative to all lands sold, leased, or granted free. So, there's an adjustment in there to account for the fact that some of the lands were granted free. Surveys, again, they serve a broad set of purposes. It's easy to say in words examples of surveys that wouldn't be relevant for NCRRs, but it's more difficult to allocate those separately. So I again include them. So I include acres of land granted free when I calculate the amount of surveys to allocate, survey expenses to allocate, which means that I include more surveys expenses than I do land expenses. But I include them throughout. So here's an example. This is on slide 141. I'm sorry. Some snapshots from the report of the Minister of Lands and Forests for the year 1943. I have a statement here under the Division of Surveys. What do they do? It says they do a great deal of aerial mapping and survey work for outside services and for other government departments. It goes on about why they do what they do. But included in that report is this table that I've snapped out in the bottom right, which is an accounting of their aerial surveys. And you'll see at the bottom of that table, they surveyed 7,415 square miles. This is before metric. And you can see on the far right, for departments of lands and forests only, that was 940 square miles. For other departments in the middle, they surveyed almost 3,700 square miles of land, much of which was for the Department of Highways. And then on the left, they do some survey work for timber companies. Now, my understanding from reading the reports is they do receive some revenue from those companies. They don't do it for free, but it's a sense in which the aerial surveys serve other purposes, right? Highways, I think we can agree that's not in HEPCO, that might be properly charged against hydro. So there's other work going on, but I include it all. And on the next slide, 142, this is a similar excerpt from the same report. And this is talking about ground surveys, because it wasn't all done by plane.
Sorry, I'm going to stop you for a moment because I just want to be clear. I understand this. On slide 141,
Yes.
although there's 940 for Department of Lands and Forests out of a grand total of 7,415, in your calculation of expenses, you included all the surveys?
That's correct.
Oh, okay.
On slide 142, this is a summary of ground surveys. Here they don't provide a quantitative measure, so we can say what was the effort on each of these issues. But you can see they're surveying townships, they're surveying summer resorts, for which we do include revenue. They're also surveying boathouse sites and monuments, for which there is no direct Crown resource revenue that we include. It's difficult to apportion this in any meaningful way. So again, I include it all. I just include the summary to say, it's not just me thinking about the ways surveys might be unrelated to resources, but the department itself is showing that. So I felt that was helpful. This is now slide 143. During this period of time, Ontario operated air services, and we see an expense line item in the public accounts in many years for air service. And the planes can serve many purposes. For a while, they were all bucketed together. But there are some reports from the ministers of lands and forests in different years that give us estimates of the number of hours spent flying on each of, half a dozen or so different functions. So we can use that data to estimate what share of the hours flown were for related expenses.
So these columns are hours.
Yeah,
flown.
they're hours flown. Sorry, yeah, they're not dollars. Yeah, at the bottom we say total hours there, but
Oh, I
that's
got
a
it.
good catch. That should be up top. So these are hours flown, and so my assumption is the percent of hours flown in support of relevant activities is a reasonable proxy for the percent of the cost of air services that should be attributed. So I've highlighted two items that are relevant, in my opinion: timber management and lands. That works out to about 9%. The first row for fire ranging is one where, again, Professors Bodwin, Smart, and I have a difference of opinion. And as a result, they include more air service expense, a much higher percentage. That 9% is higher, but it's based on the same method, if you will. They don't include 100% because they also agree, like fish and wildlife, for example.
They agree that fish and wildlife is in or out.
Out. So methodologically, we're aligned. On the details, we differ a little bit, but that relates to fire, which is the next topic to talk about. So I spoke earlier in the context of the arbitration papers that fire ranging, and sorry, I'm now on slide 144. Fire ranging and fire protection can serve multiple purposes. Right? It's not just about protecting land for timber purposes that can be sold or on which trees can be harvested to generate direct crown resource revenues. There's many things beyond direct crown resource revenues. Even if we wanted to limit ourselves to just the benefits from the commercial forestry, there are indirect tax revenues and other benefits that come. Okay. So I include all fire expenses until 1917 because I cannot reliably apportion the fire expenses between those different buckets, if you will. After 1917, we see a lot more fire protection tax or other, it has other names, but specific charges levied on users of Crown Fire Services. These are commercial users of the forest or the mines. They have to pay a particular amount to the Crown related to, I say it's fire protection tax. The name varies in other years, but that's the basic idea. The Crown moved to some kind of quasi-cost recovery idea. And looking from 1917 to 1930, through this levy, they recover about 30%.
You say 1870,
Sorry, 1917
1917.
to 1930.
Okay.
They recover about 30% of the amount spent on fire management. That's something I calculate for the rents analysis, to which I'll return just to give a flavor. So when commercial users start paying for fire protection, I remove those payments. I don't think those revenues are direct Crown resource revenues. I think they're paying for fire service, fire protection, helping contribute to the benefits they're receiving. So I don't include those as a direct Crown resource revenue. And I also remove all fire charges because a portion is being offset by the commercial users. And the balance I'm associating with general government functions like the protection of our property, infrastructure, the other reasons we would have a fire ranging service separate from commercial timber operations.
Can I just ask, when you say from 1917 to 1930, they recover about 30%, is that recovery the fees that are charged, the tax?
Yes.
Or is that sales, or is that general taxes?
No. That's the specific fire protection tax or
Got it.
forest protection. It has a couple of different names, but this is the kind of specific fire revenue, if you will,
Yep.
divided by fire expenses. I don't include in that stumpage payments or income taxes.
So I think we should be clear about this, and I'm not sure we are. The 30% is 30% of the fire expenses incurred.
Yes, the fire specific Crown revenues over this period. are
Fire
thir-
specific Crown revenues?
Yes, the fire specific Crown revenues are 30% of the fire specific Crown expenses.
And so,
So if the Crown spent $100 fighting fires,
yes,
it collected $30 through the fire protection tax.
okay, and you don't include that tax as a revenue source,
That's right.
and you then don't include the expense either.
That's correct.
And you need to explain that for me one more time.
Sure. So the total amount spent on fire protection serves many purposes. Once we have some indication of what the Crown can recover from commercial users, I associate that revenue with the expense of providing the service to those users and the balance of the expense to the general government functions.
In other places in your work, and I actually can't say that I attribute this to you or some other report that I read. In other places, there's been reference to user fees.
Mhm.
Would you put this in the same category as a user fee? Sort of like the parks, but
Yeah.
parks aren't,
Yeah.
park fees are
Once
not
there is a
included.
fee here, I do treat it a similar way.
Okay. So
Um,
it's called a tax, but it could be if you walk into a forest, you have to put your money in the box, and that's your fire protection tax.
Right. I mean, they administer it through charges to the commercial companies, but yeah, you could probably think of it a similar way. If you're engaged in an activity that's using the woods, and I won't go through the details of how the act, because it changes over time,
Mhm.
levies these charges. But yeah, you have to pay. So that's a good way of thinking about it.
So, and so, as Mr. Schachter said, summarizing from your evidence, you don't include the $30 as revenue, but you presume it covers the resource-related fire protection activities. And so you then attribute the 70 or the 70% to other government revenues.
That's right.
Okay.
Sorry. Other government revenues or objectives.
Objectives.
So they might be doing it to preserve property.
Right.
Right, so the next topic here on slide 145 is hydroelectricity. So, and I think it's important here to talk about, remember the hydroelectricity revenues we talk about are the revenues that hydroelectric companies, private or public, including HEPCO, paid to the Crown for using the water to make the power. So I'm not talking about the expenses of those companies of operating, right? That would be getting into their profits. I'm talking about the expenses for the government of collecting, supporting, and regulating that stream of payments, those water rental fees. So in the Ontario public accounts, there are no expenses specifically attributable to those water rental fees collected by the Crown. I assume there must be some relevant expense. Otherwise, it sounds a little bit like a free lunch, and economists don't like free lunches. So I say, or I assume 2% of revenues were the cost of collecting, regulating, and supporting those revenues. That's an estimate based on the general expense of like tax collection and other things. If you were to look at the Canada Revenue Agency, for example, they collect the lion's share of the taxes. It costs them between 1% and 2% to operate. So I take that number. It's a small number, but again, the hydro facilities aren't moving, but somebody does have to collect the payments, make sure, calculate the correct amounts. I've seen lots of material produced in Discovery, indexing by power station what was paid. So someone had to maintain those records. So I use 2%. Mr. Hamal, one of the experts retained by Ontario, agrees that that is reasonable. He agrees there's no specific number, but the basis is sound. Professors Bodway and Smart don't attribute expenses to those revenues. So here I include a few extra expenses than they do.
From your reading of Bodway and Smart's treatment, do they explain why they take zero expenses against the hydroelectricity revenues?
Sure. As I read their analysis and reports, it's because there's nothing in the public accounts that specifically identify an expense.
So slide 146.
Yes. This is where I propose to start going line by line through the expenses in the 6-year period, 1915 to 1920.
So what we're about to embark on, you're going to do a deep dive to try and provide the court with some guidance on what your process was and how you and Bodway and Smart differ on a number of matters.
That's correct.
And you're using 1915 to 1920 simply as an illustrative example, correct?
That's right. Of this period, 1898 to 1945. So I think as we're aware, every few years, the ministry names change, different branches and responsibilities can move between ministries. As a result, every few years, the structure of the public accounts change as well. And so 1915 to 1920 is one 6-year period where the structure is largely unchanged, so we can sum it up. But sometimes it only lasts 2 years before a department name changes, and then certain responsibilities are moved in and out. So rather than do that for each of the maybe 8 or 10 time periods, I picked one in the middle to walk through in some detail.
But to make a point that I hope is obvious, every single year between 1898 and 1945, you did this analysis.
That's correct.
And did you do it for a similar analysis after 1945,
That's correct.
all the way up to 2019?
Similar, yeah. We can
Okay.
talk about that.
So let's.
That's how I reached the conclusion that I had to change my approach after 1945, is the detail wasn't there, but yes.
Okay. So we'll get to that. So why don't we just we can start explaining these charts, which look very colorful, but
Okay, sure.
need some explanation.
Sure. So what is this? This is data from my work papers.
This being slide 147.
Yes, slide 147 over the next several slides, where I've transcribed data from the public accounts and, based on how I've been able to see it reported, and then I compare my treatment to Professors Bodley and Smart's. They provided a work paper as well. Later on, I'll refer to it in more detail, called expenses. So basically, I have a big Excel workbook, they have a big Excel workbook, and we're trying to put them together to do a line by line comparison. So let me maybe explain what the columns are, and then I'll start marching.
Sure.
Row by row. So the first column, it just goes 1, 2, 3 sequentially. That's just something I've added to make our conversation easier today, so we can talk about a number that doesn't
That's on the
appear.
far left,
Far left.
just the numbers.
That doesn't appear in the public accounts.
Okay.
The next column, called line item, these are the line items that appear in the public accounts of Ontario. And you'll notice every now and then there's a bold heading, Department of Lands, Forests and Mines, for example.
Mhm.
So those are the salaries of the Departments of Lands, Forests and Mines on line 1. We skip down a few lines, we see Forestry Branch in bold. Then line 8 is the salaries of the Forestry Branch, and so on. So, it kind of appears in a nested format, as we've seen, where it squiggles in and out. This is how we've categorized it here. The next column, categorization. That's how I've categorized the expenses as between different revenue sources, or in the case of, say, the first item, head office. Right? The salaries of the department are a head office type expense.
And this categorization column, that's your assessment.
That's correct.
And we're gonna get later on into the chart as to what Bodway and Smart agree or disagree with that, I take it, yes?
That's correct.
Okay,
The next column is my treatment. And so this is where we're going to have included, excluded, or overhead. And so this is, the blue, orange, and teal boxes we looked at earlier about how we could separate these expenses. For overhead, I then have an allocation rule of how I allocate that overhead. So what does this mean? So let's take the first one as an example. Civil government overhead means that it will be allocated based on the relevant and the total expenses of everything in the whole department. So I can't attribute it. If we contrast that with, say, lines 8, 9, and 10, I call that forestry overhead, which means I'm going to allocate.
So is that like the head office?
Exactly. That's like the head office.
sorry, which one is the head office? Let's be,
Lines
civil
like
government
1,
overhead.
2, and 3. Yeah, civil
Yes.
government overhead.
right,
So lines 8, 9, and 10, I call forestry overhead, for example, which means I'm going to allocate those using that same overhead formula, but only including forestry expenses. So included forestry over total forestry. Okay. So it'll be methodologically the same as the first set of salaries, but it might be a different percentage. And the next column is the total 1915 to 1920. So just to be clear, these data exist each of those 6 years. I've just summed them up, so we don't have to look at quite so many numbers. So up until there, that's kind of all my work. The next column, B and S total, 1915 to 1920. That's the total from Professors Bodway and Smart's data for the same line items. You'll see we basically agree every time on the total. Again, we shared data, so that's a good sign. And I've included it here just to make clear that when I match a line item called salaries, we know we're matching the same line item. The next column.
so I just want to stop you for a second, just to be clear about something. You've got three, you're talking about the three greens agrees?
I hadn't
No.
got there yet, but yeah.
Oh,
I can.
sorry.
No.
When I had thought I heard the word agree, and the numbers are the same, does that mean, or is the court supposed to take from that, that both you and Bodway and Smart applied the exact same dollar amount? Or not?
Oh, sorry. I see your point. The fact the number in each of those two columns is the same, sticking with the first row, 591493, 591493. That just means that we agree on the number.
You
That
counted up the
We
salaries.
counted up the same way.
Okay.
Exactly. I've included those just to show that. What we then do with that number, we may or may not agree. And that's the purpose of the next column, which is called group. And this is where it's been kind of color coded to say, where do we take the same approach, a different approach, or a similar approach? So in this case, the first three are all green and labeled agree, because we all agree that they're overhead. And then the last column is the label from the Bodway and Smart data. Again, just for sake of transparency, if you went to their data, that's how it will be labeled.
So what you're agreeing to is column 3, my treatment.
Yes. Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Okay, so as you can see, everything in Civil Government Department of Lands, Forests, and Mines, those first 7 rows, well, say everything. Rows 1 to 3 and 5 to 7, I treat as overhead, civil government overhead, because they're incurred, in the head office, salaries, contingencies, extra services. That's as much detail as we have. Who knows what those extra services were? Traveling expenses, etc. The only one I exclude is membership fees to various associations, because joining an association doesn't lead to direct Crown resource revenues. And we agree, we being me and Professors Bodway and Smart, that overhead is the correct way of approaching salaries, contingencies, and advertising. The next 4 rows are unmatched What does that mean? It just means sometimes in Professors Bodway and Smart's data, they aggregated some of the smaller items and it shows up as a different line item. So I wasn't able to match it to my data. At the end, our totals will match. They have the same amount, but I don't want to suggest that we agree or disagree on these 4 items because I don't see it separately in their accounts to be able to say. So that's just what the gray means. So as I said, I'm trying to do both how I treat it and where possible, provide the contrast. But in general, these unmatched amounts are the small dollar amounts, right? Okay. So next we have forestry branch. And you'll see there, the grouping, which is that second to last column, is all yellow. It's yellow because we partially agree. I include salaries as overhead, and I use a different allocator, forestry overhead, as I discussed. Professors Bodway and Smart include all of the salaries of forestry. So what does that mean? Taking the number of $47,782, that would mean they would attribute all of that to direct grant resource revenues. I would attribute a portion based on the relevance of other forestry revenues yet to be discussed later on. In this period of time, that's probably a high portion, but there's going to be a slight difference in how we treat it.
So when we read the words Bodway and Smart included, it's 100% included.
That's correct. And H, B,
Mhm.
is overhead. The percent included in my overhead will be some number less than 100.
Your fraction.
My fraction, exactly. And again, my rationale is the forestry branch does some things unrelated to timber management. And those things would have required some overhead expense. So some small portion of this 47,000 should be attributed to those other expenses.
And are we going to get to some slides that flesh that out?
We will, yes.
Oh,
We're just dealing with the kind of head office level stuff as of now. We see something similar there. Sorry, did you want to?
No, I was just checking my watch, that's all. Sorry.
Okay.
Maybe I should just pause for a moment. How are you? Is reporter doing okay? What's that?
I would love a break.
Okay. What would suit the court and the report?
15.
15 minutes?
This court will recess for 15 minutes. Thank you. This court is now resumed. You may be seated.
Mr. Hutchings, before the break, you had just talked about salaries forestry and 47,782. And I think you were going to go on to talk about some of the other portions of slide 147.
That's correct. So the next group of expenses on slide 147 are lines 13 to 16, which are the salaries, contingencies, plans, maps, and advertising, and traveling expenses at the Bureau of Mines. Again, this is not related to a specific mining function at the moment. So I treat this, my allocation rule is mining overhead. So when we get into other expenses more directly related to or indirectly related to mining, I'll allocate this in proportion to that overhead ratio.
That's when you do rents or when you do both. I'm sorry. When you get, I'm a little bit confused now.
Sure.
Can you try that again? I want to.
Okay. So for these expenses at the Bureau of Mines, I will allocate them based on the expenses that are relevant or not relevant, as I'll discuss in a little bit, that are more particular to mining activity. So that's why I note the allocation rule as mining overhead.
Okay.
So the salaries of the Bureau of Mines support many parts of the Bureau of Mines. So what's an example for mining in particular? It's not relevant. Gas inspectors at this time rolled up into the Bureau of Mines. And we know there was no natural gas activity in the RST. Right? So we're going to come at a later point.
So there are no gas inspectors there.
Exactly. So in a later bit, I will exclude gas inspectors. So based on the exclusion of gas inspectors as one example, that's not relevant. And so the ratio of the relevant to the total, gas inspectors will be in the total, but not the top. So the overhead of this salaries component will be a little less than 100%. And that's why it's again colored yellow, those 4 lines in the group column, because I treat them as overhead. And Professors Bodwin and Smart include them all. We do agree on the last item, typewriters and other specialties, that's overhead. We're not sure for whose benefit each typewriter was bought. So over the page, this is now slide 148.
Thank you.
The first branch here is the colonization roads branch. As we discussed earlier, I don't include expenses for colonization roads. They were directed at those other benefits. And so that's why we have a pink color in the group, or red, I'm not sure, that says H equals EXCL excluded, Bodwin and Smart equals INCL included. So these kind of things we disagree on. That's lines 18 to 21. The next batch of expenses relate to fish and game. Those are line items 22 to 27. So these are the salaries, contingencies, authoring of the fish and games reports, traveling expenses, advertising, and office equipment for the fish and game branch. I exclude it, and as do Professors Bodwin and Smart. And so the coloring on the right is green. We agree on that treatment for those 6 line items.
Thank you.
The next 2 line items fall under the sales branch, salaries and contingencies.
So you've got a reference there, note under game and fisheries.
Yes, so the sales branch is in the Department of Game and Fisheries. As I have an example in the next slide to highlight it. So for that reason, I excluded it. Professors Bodwin and Smart included. Again, it falls under the sales branch. The branch isn't labeled fish and game. But actually, if you want to skip ahead to the next slide, maybe we can deal with this example and we'll come back. So we see from 1918 to 1920, there are expenses at the sales branch. This is a snapshot of one of my work papers. And what do these connect with? The next slide, which is slide 150, show that this is expenses in the Game and Fisheries Department of the sales branch and the contingencies. Now, those numbers are hard to read, but if we go to the next slide, which is 151, I've zoomed in on them, and you can see the prior slide showed us that sales and contingencies are both in the Game and Fisheries Department section of the public accounts. And here we have salaries and contingencies, and you see the numbers there, $3,013.63. That's the number in red on the top right, slide 151. That's the number that shows up in my work papers and Professors Bodwin and Smart's work papers as salaries for the sales branch. And similarly, contingencies, $6,739. Also, it's the same amount. So because this is sales branch, in the Game and Fisheries Department, I exclude those revenue sources. So I don't know if we want to go back to slide 148. That explains lines 28 and 29. We disagree. Line 30 is colonization roads. Again, this is the actual cost of the roads group. Earlier we looked at the colonization roads branch. That was the salaries of the people administering it. So we also disagree on this, and this is a significant amount of money. And we'll summarize that at the end, where here we're going line item by line item, but not all line items are created equal. So when we get to the end, I'll add it up by revenue as well. So the next 3 items all relate to charges on Crown lands. So we have here, the Board of Surveyors, agent salaries for lands, agent salaries and disbursements. I include those in full because those are necessary to get Crown land and lease revenue, for example, as do Professors Bodway and Smart. So it's green, agree. But if we can skip ahead to slide 152, having already dealt with the sales branch example. So you'll notice the first two lines here colored gray. That's because in my data, they show up as two different line items. Release agreement, Porcupine Town Site, and exploration and estimation of timber births.
Sorry, where are you?
I'm on slide 152
Yes,
at the top.
Lines 35
Lines
and
35 and
36.
36.
okay. So the lighting here just shows up as white. Okay, got it, the gray area.
And see, I have those two rows kind of becoming one in Professor Bodway's and Smart's data. There's one item for $6,649.
Mhm.
And we can go through a matching exercise also based on the label, exploration and estimation of timber births. So given your number, exploration and estimation of timber births, or their description rather, matches mine, I can match the 1,149 of that 6,649. And the only way to come up with the other 5,500 is this other line item, release agreement, Porcupine Town Site. This isn't this is what I mentioned earlier. Sometimes they lump the smaller items together. So they include that $6,649 in full. I agree on the treatment of 1,149 related to exploring and estimating timber births. That's necessary to then know what timber births you have to sell or collect stumpage charge on. I disagree on the amount for Porcupine Town Site because Porcupine Town Site,
It's in the northeast.
exactly, it's in Timmins, it's outside of the RST. So that's why that's pink at the top.
And so you excluded and they included it. But I mean, it sounds like you've got a degree of granularity that it goes down a level than they went. Is there a reason for that you can attribute, that why yours is more detailed?
No, I mean, I transcribed every item rather than sometimes taking, you might transcribe some of the bigger items and then say, well, if I know the top 5 and the total, I can say, everything else is what's left over. And we saw that in one of the Department of Lands and Forest report earlier, unallocated.
Mhm.
I wasn't there in 1943 or 47 when they wrote that report, but presumably you're only going to expend, we're going to do the big ticket items and we'll have another category.
Mhm.
That's all I can say is that seems to be the method taken.
Let's speak about your method. Can you just give the court a sense of the degree of care that you put into trying to sort all this out in terms of properly analyzing what the expenses are, whether they should be included, excluded, or partially included?
Yeah. So a lot of it starts with, what are the data? Actually, your comment is getting dark in here. Per your comment about the number of line items, I realize now I can't read this either. It's, it just starts with what are all the items, and then having to go through and assess. And I find it easier, given we know, right, ex ante, we are going to have this allocation matching problem that the public accounts or the Crown generally doesn't record expenses related to direct revenues, separate from indirect revenues, separate from other government functions. To make an attribution or matching, you want as much detail as possible to try to separate out those things that are likely to be relevant or not relevant. So to start with everything is a good starting point.
So you say start with everything as a good starting point. But I wonder if you could just give us a sense of the degree of granularity that, if maybe you can't describe it generally, but I just want to get a sense as to how deep of a dive you went in all of this whole mess of trying to figure out the expenses and revenues.
Well, I think as we'll go through now, there's 129 line items for these 6 years. There's a lot of line items for a number of other years. And, again, a lot of this is driven by the data availability and also kind of not knowing what you don't know until you go out and try to go through the work, right? If this was more recent times, we'd all go on statscan.ca or something and download a bunch of data. Things have been kept in a much more reliable fashion. We know we have lots of tools to collect data in an easy, free, cheap way. Not having that, you have to go through a lot of historical documents, and sometimes it looks like something might bear fruit, but maybe for some reason or another, the data is only reported in 1 year. So you think you have a method that works, then you read the annual report for the next year, and for reasons unknown to me, they don't report the same level of detail. As we were looking at with the profit tax paying mines for a number of years, Ontario reported every single mine, how much it paid. It's really helpful. Starting in 1954, they stopped. I'm not sure why, but that means you then have to think about, okay, what's the next method I'm going to use after that? So it's a little, it's just easier to do the more data you gather. I think personally, that's why it was helpful, exchanging data both on revenues and also on proxies with Professors Bodway and Smart, that to the extent there's a big historical undertaking, what data could you find from 1901? What data could you find from 1935? It's a long process. Eventually you hit diminishing marginal returns and have to make reasonable assumptions given the data as they exist.
Okay.
As a follow-up on that question, my question arose at my question on that topic arose at slide 147 when you said gas inspectors were included, but we know there was no gas activity or no gas available in that area, in that territory at the time. That seems like a bit of research when you see a gas expense. Or was there some other thing that made it apparent to you that there was no gas in the territory at the time?
No, that's research that happened elsewhere along the way. So we see gas revenue as well. Like when, I don't know if it was any of the screenshots I shared here, but if we're reading the public accounts, looking at taxes, there will be collections from gas tax, not gasoline tax like we pay now, but from natural gas.
Natural gas.
And you see that revenue item, and then at least I think to myself, well, is that meaningful? Was there any in the territory? So you do a bit of public research, becomes pretty clear that that was more down around Lake Erie, not in this area. And so then we know not to look at, not to include it. But there's
Not
some
to
amount of-
include the revenues or the expenses in relation to that.
Exactly. And I don't think we disagree on that. But Professors Bodway and Smart don't count gas revenue either. I think between all of us, that was something we agreed early and quick. Is factually, it seemed like there was none there. So,
Well, wait, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit confused now because I thought you said on slide 148 that they did include some portion of expenses that included gas salaries. Did I misunderstand?
maybe if you go back to 147, it's under the Bureau of Mines. My point on why I needed to treat the salaries at the Bureau of Mines as overhead is because under the Bureau of Mines is our head office. Under the Bureau of Mines,
We're
some
gas
activity-
inspectors.
Exactly. There were some gas inspectors, there were some mining inspectors. That head office should be split between the two. So I should only count a portion of that head office related to the mining stuff, not gas inspectors.
But did Bodway and Smart include in the cost of the gas inspectors?
No, they included the head office function, part of which would have been a part of the gas. We haven't yet got to the salaries of gas inspectors and mining inspectors.
Okay,
This
so I
is the
should
kind of-
wait for it for.
My understanding is that Mr. Hutchings split the overhead because part of it was attributable to gas inspectors,
That's correct.
whereas Bodway and Smart did not make that split. That's why I said it followed from your question on level of granularity, went down,
Okay,
found that there were gas inspectors But if you didn't go down that far or didn't know that there was no gas in that territory, you might legitimately include all of the overhead
Right.
costs. Do I have that right?
You do. Okay. All right, so where were you? You were, before I interrupted?
Slide 152.
Okay.
So lines 37, 38, 39. Those all relate to forest ranging, Ottawa agency. Ottawa agency, let me clarify, has nothing to do with the federal government. It's just where there was an agent located related to monitoring forestry. These are all Ontario public accounts. Each of those activities relates to forestry. I include them. Professors Bodway and Smart include them. So it's colored green. We agree. The next two line items, 40 and 41, relate to forest reserves. Here we have a difference of opinion. In these years, it's large, but the program then disappears. So as we'll see later, it doesn't have a big impact in the aggregate, but in these years, it's meaningful. Forest reserves was a program to set aside certain blocks of forested land to restrict development, restrict access for settlement, and so on. I exclude them because much of the activities was related to fire protection in that region and also for preserving lands, not direct Crown resource revenues. So there being no direct Crown resource revenues tied to the forest reserves, I didn't include the expenses. Professor Bodway and Smart do include the expenses. The next big item is 43 and I guess 43 through 46. We have yet another new color. It's a orangish color, I guess, maybe fire orange, and it relates to fire expenses, fire ranging, firefighting, etc. So why is it orange here? Well, as I discussed earlier, from 1915, well, up until 1970, which in this period we're looking at, 1915 to 1920, I include fire expenses. So 15, 16, 17, we agree. And starting in 1918, I exclude those fire specific charges on the revenue side, and I exclude the fire expense. So 1918, 1919, 1920, we disagree. Rather than have a bunch of words in there about include in certain periods, I just colored it fire because I knew we were going to have a discussion about it. Line 47, for what it's worth, there's an entry on a purchase and maintenance of automobiles and other vehicles, not specific to a branch as I could find, so I included it as overhead. And they included. Yeah, the last item is also related to fire. So it's the same fire engine color. Over the page to 153. Then we have two forest reserve and reforestation related expenses.
Could you speak up?
Oh,
just a
sure,
bit?
my bad. Lines 50 and 51, which are the first two entries on slide 153. The first relates to forest reserves. So I exclude this, as I talked about on the previous slide. Line 51 relates to purchase, care, and feed of horses and purchase of seed, nursery stock, fertilizer, and nursery equipment. Can relate to forest reserves or reforestation. I exclude both, as I've already talked about. So that's why we have that pink or red color that I exclude and they include. Next, purchasing options and rentals of land. And it's not specific as to what that's for. I include it as overhead. So it's yellow again. The next several items.
Sorry, can I just go back for a second? Just to line item 51 and under the column line item, that's a line item as it appears in the public accounts.
That's correct.
And the B&S label it's got something about supervision of forest reserves.
So this is another
And this is
example.
one of the ones where there was a mismatching and they've combined them together.
Yes. again, given we know one of the numbers where we can match the title, that then just becomes a search for what is the other expense that bounce. So here on line 50, we have the same label. I have 19,230. They have 24,146. The exercise becomes, can we match that missing $4,916? And we can. So we infer that it must be this other line item that's been collapsed.
Okay, sorry.
No,
All right.
So it's a double count then?
Oh, no. Sorry. It's just that they have one line item for $24,000.
Mm-hmm.
I have a line item for 19,000 and a line item for 5,000.
Okay.
They add up to the same amount.
Exactly, they add up to the same amount. This isn't,
But the
5.1.
degree of granularity you have tells you that some of it, in your view, should be in relation to forest reserves, and some of it should be in relation to forestry.
yes.
You exclude them both for reasons which you've given, but it's just an exercise in identifying the category that with a greater degree of granularity that you took.
Yeah,
Okay. I think I understand.
again, I'm trying to do two things at once.
Mhm.
First describe what I've done. So I could have just stopped the table, between our two totals. But then we'd have to go again through all the line items again on our areas of agreement or disagreement. So I'm trying to be efficient. But
Okay,
that does lead to this matching problem in some years.
okay,
So then the Colors Act, the next several line items we agree are related to surveys, lines 55, 56, 57, 58. Again, take line 55. This is the main survey expense item this year, $450,000. We agree on that. It's related to surveys. I point that out just again, not all line items are created equal, and this is one of the larger line items. The next disagreement, 59 and 60, well, 59 rather, relates to reforestation. And we have a disagreement about whether reforestation expenses should be included. I spoke about this a little earlier, but because of the period of time in which we're in, the other annual reports of the department show that there was no reforestation in Northern Ontario or in the RST, or rather that it was all focused in the South. I exclude those expenses. I'm going to come to reforestation a bit when we focus on the disagreements later on in this presentation. That's why that item is pink. Line 60. So this is investigation of forest tree diseases and the purchase and maintenance of a motor car. But let's focus on the first part of that, the investigation of forest tree diseases. There are a few times where in the public accounts, we see expenses on public inquiries, commissions, investigations, things like that. I, as a rule, don't include those because they're not related to directing, collecting, regulating, or supporting direct resource revenues. They're a general government function, if you will. They might improve how the government makes a decision, but until the government puts in place any new regulations that might come out when their expenses would be reflected in salaries and so on, I don't include the expenses. But this being the first one, I felt I should explain.
thank you.
They're very small. You want to go over the page. This is 154. This is a slide of generally small items. Let's take the first one. There's an allowance to a school. We both agree that should be excluded. That's line 63. Next line relates to extinguishing fires. So that gets our same fire color. And again, we have the different treatment before and after 1917. Line 65 is a grant to the Canadian Forestry Association. I discussed this a little bit up front when we had some other grants to industry associations, because those aren't connected to a direct Crown resource revenue. I exclude them. There are a couple of examples of this, but they do tend to be fairly small dollar amounts. The next line item to discuss is 67, which which is investigation in reforestation. Again, for kind of two reasons. It's a government investigation and it's about reforestation. I exclude that expense. The other ones are gray, which just to remind us is unmatched. You can see they're very small dollar amounts. And so I can't undertake a matching between how I recorded and it shows up in Professor Bogway's and Smart's data.
Nonetheless, where it's unmatched and you reference it as overhead, you included it as
That's
part of
correct.
overhead.
That's correct. So I do include a part of it.
Okay.
In general, if I see something small and very general like this, I take line 70. I don't know what services Mr. Scott rendered for those $42, but I'll assume they probably did something towards the department, so I'll allocate it in an amount of overhead.
And just be clear, the Mr. Scott for services rendered in the year 1918, that's actually right in the public accounts for that year?
Yes,
That degree of granularity in the public accounts.
yes.
Okay.
And you can go in the salaries section if you want to and see each individual person, what they received. They don't always include their title, which makes it more difficult to allocate or attribute, but there are some years where several pages are just first initial, last name, dollar amount repeated over and over and over again. But again, because it doesn't say what those people are doing, except what branch they're in, that's an example of detail that I didn't record because it's not going to be helpful.
Okay.
The
And
last-
you're going to take us somewhere in here to the part of your report where you lose that granularity in later years in the public accounts?
Yes.
Okay, I'll wait for it then.
Line 72 is another example of an investigation. This one's a commission on sundry charges. Again, same logic as before. Having an investigation or a commission of inquiry is unrelated to the direct resource revenues themselves. The Crown may choose to change its policies, and then we will include those revenues and expenses if there is a new revenue coming from it. But the process of the investigation itself, I don't include. Okay, so here's so now you'll notice there at the top of this slide, 155. It's on the top, but in the top left corner, italicized are the words mines and mining, which means, if we were reading these public accounts, we would see that there's kind of been a tab in and we're talking about mines and mining. So the first item here, line item 73, is the experimental treatment of ore and collection of minerals. This is kind of a research-based expense, and we will discuss, or I'll discuss a little later. In general, Professors Bogway and Smart and I disagree on the treatment of research expenses. I exclude them because government research supports many other purposes and is not tied to a direct Crown resource revenue. And as we'll see a little later as well, this isn't a quantitatively large difference between my analysis and theirs. So the next one is, again, that we have this grouping of 3 line items, 74, 75, and 76, relating to mines. So I'll deal with mine on the left. Line item 74 is explorations, investigations, and inspections. And this falls under the category of mining. I include that expense because it's related to exploring, investigating, and inspecting the mines. We need to inspect them to know how much revenue to collect from them. The next line item is explorations, investigations, and inspections, the colon, to pay salaries and expenses of gas and oil well inspectors, etc. $65,286. So again, because there's no gas revenue included, because there's no monetization, Crown monetization of gas in the RST, I exclude this amount. And then line item 76,
Just before you go there, Bodway and Smart included.
in Professors Bodway and Smart's data, there's a label mining development, inspections, explorations, etc. And there's a number there of $126,859. This is another example of that number doesn't appear in the public accounts. So we look at what are the line items that add up to that number with a similar name. And as I go through this analysis, I see it's these three items kind of combined into one. And so that's why on the right, under this group, we agree on the top line. We disagree on the middle line, the salaries and inspectors of gas and oil well inspectors. And we have this yellow on the bottom line. So of that 126,859, I include the 27,783. I exclude 65,286. And I treat 33,790 as overhead. So it's partially included. And that last bucket of 33,790 is treated as overhead because you can see from the description, it includes gas and oil well inspectors, salaries, equipment, and expenses of temporary field and other assistants, equipment and expenses of geologists, topographers, mines assessors. So it's kind of blended together. There's some mining in there, some non-mining in there. So I included on an overhead basis. Okay, so line 77 is another example of salaries. I treat it as overhead. Professor Bodway's and Smart included in full. 78 is a small line item.
Sorry, is this still under mines and mining?
Yes.
Okay, and is there, if it's mining salaries, explain why you would consider it overhead as opposed to being totally included?
Because again, some of those salaries might be in support of the gas and oil well inspectors, as an example. So we need to attribute it based on those determinations that can be made that are mining versus gas. So, salaries is kind of an undifferentiated mass, if you will. But we know some of those are probably in support of both mining and gas, as we saw from above. So I allocate it based on that first division.
Okay.
So then we have legal assistance enforcing the Mining Act. See, that is related to a direct crown resource revenue. So differ on that treatment for $31. Line item 79 is another different thing. The provincial assay office. So the province set up one and then later added an additional office for testing assay cores and doing chemical analysis of minerals. And this was operated in a little bit of a fee-for-service model, so companies could pay the province to do the work. On that basis, I excluded.
Do you include in the revenue from the assay office?
No, sir. That's why it's an offsetting adjustment. Okay, so line 80, we have the expenses of mining recorders. That's relevant. We agree on that. And you can see this is another one of those larger ticket items, $149,000. Okay. So over the page, we're now 156. The first three items, excuse me, I've grouped together. I had separate line items for unpaid accounts. In looking at Professor Bodway and Smart's data, we can match their general category of unpaid accounts. We agree on two of the three. We disagree on the provincial assay office unpaid accounts. Again, because we disagree on the provincial assay office generally. That's the $9 in the middle.
So the difference here on this line, the degree of granularity is $9 in, during the period 1915 to 1920.
That's correct.
And then as it would flow through in the final grand scheme of thing, it's some percentage of that that gets, you attribute, that they attribute some percentage of that $9, I guess, some percentage of all of the $9 to expenses, and you would include none of it.
That's correct.
Okay.
And, also be fair, this is at a provincial wide level. So
Oh,
this
right.
all then has to be allocated to RST as well. Because all of the provincial account data is for Ontario. So we first go through this relevance determination at the Ontario level, and then allocate using some of the geographic allocation rules I discussed earlier, where we have the data of the mining recorders, for example.
so your methodology was perhaps, there's an expression, but you're spending energy to, I guess, to make sure your methodology captures only what it's supposed to capture, is I guess, but in the final analysis, the $9 probably doesn't make much of a difference,
That's right.
because it's only a portion of the $9.
That's correct.
Okay.
But the items that are a couple of $100,000 that we talked about, those will make a difference in the final adding up.
Right, right.
So some other, maybe I'll focus on the disagreements. Line 86, for services for a mineral exhibit. Again, I think kind of treating it similar to the fees for professional associations or exhibits at the universities. They're not connected to direct Crown resource revenues, so I exclude those. Line item 88, we again have a general category of legal investigations and reports. I exclude those, and Professors Bugman and Smart include them. Line items 89 and 90, the mineral display at exhibitions or services for a mineral exhibit in Toronto, for similar reasons as the associations or attending conventions. I don't see the connection between the direct Crown resource revenue and this expense. And these expenses, if we think about those three buckets of direct revenues, indirect revenues, other benefits, it's a much closer connection with other benefits. That's line item 91 as well, society membership. Line item 93 is an allowance for special services for the Nickel Commission. Line item 94 is a legal investigation. Those fall under that same bucket. I'm only aggregating because I think we can also see the dollar amounts now that you've helpfully pointed out to me, Mr. Schechter, that $9 doesn't add up to very much. Go over the page. So we're now on 157. So line item 96, this is a clerical work and preparation of a report for the Mining Commission and for purchase of 25 bound copies of same. Again, related to a commission judgment. I don't
These are
see
very sensitive topics around here, bound copies of things.
It is an open question on how the binding works. If it's the 2-pin or the 3-pin, plastic. Again, 97 is research work, as discussed earlier. That's more closely associated with those other benefits to the Crown rather than the direct Crown resource revenues. The next three items are small and relate to me not knowing where Mr. Collins or Ledoux or Mrs. Goulet did their work for the refund. Taking line item 100, refund of a fee paid for a miner's license would be a proper expense if you're refunding it. because the Crown shouldn't have collected it. That's a reasonable expense. I don't know where that was, so I just allocate it on an overhead basis.
Geographically,
Geographically, that's correct.
so you don't know whether it's in RST or not.
That's correct. Natural Gas Advisory Board, I wasn't able to match that with Professor Bodway and Smart's data, but I exclude it because it relates to natural gas. I think generally they discuss natural gas not being in the territory.
Generally, they what?
They discuss how natural gas is not in the treaty territory. We agree that there's no gas revenue, for example. 102 special surveys, we agree on that. So here we have the Mines Branch, Department of Mines, unclear what they're doing, but because again, the Mines Branch can include gas work, I treat it as overhead, and that's why we have the yellow coloring on the right-hand side. Why don't I go down to line 107, because we're starting to get into some more meaningful numbers again.
Yes.
Algonquin National Park. Now, it is a provincial park, but it's named it's named the Algonquin National Park. But that's a park. It's a substantial amount of money, $185,000 over the 6-year period. And we agree that that's not included. I think the court had mentioned earlier, this is a user fee thing, so parks are out. We agree on that. Over the page, smaller tickets, but lines 110 and 111 and 112 and 113, again, all relate to parks. And Professors Bodway and Smart and I agree that those aren't relevant for purposes of calculating net Crown resource revenue.
By my eyes, you have a new blue category.
Oh.
Is that just a color problem, or is there something
No,
special
there
about
were,
Ryan Brothers?
Sorry. There were a couple of items where I include something that Professors Bodway and Smart exclude. This relates to the clearing of a right of way. So I include that in this year, $442. In 115, we again have an investigation. This one particularly is investigation on the fuel question and the purchase, manufacturing, and the handling of wood fuel, and the manufacturing and handling of peat fuel. Have 2 reasons to exclude this from net Crown resource revenues. The first being not in support of a direct Crown resource revenue. No revenue coming about from this investigation, in my mind. And the second is, based on the historical record, the peat was not in the treaty territory.
And this is still under mines and mining.
Sorry, no, we've moved back to more general expenses.
Oh, okay.
My apologies for not calling that out. I think around 107. Want to go to slide 157. You'll see there at the very last line item, all the tabs have kind of moved back a little bit. We're now kind of in, so if you see like Algonquin National Park on the chart
Yes.
is I'll say tabbed out.
Oh, I
Yeah,
see.
so we're now into different set of kind of one-off expenses.
Okay.
So, that's helpful.
So you were saying peat moss is outside the treaty territory? Or peat fuel, excuse me.
Yeah. Well, this is also an investigation, which is the main reason that they're investigating a potential use of fuel. No direct Crown resource revenues associated with that. Okay. We then have, here's a one-off, line 116, salaries and expenses not otherwise provided for the Department of Land, Forests and Mines. I treat that as overhead, and Professor Bodway and Smart included. I treat it as overhead because it's not otherwise provided for. I don't know where I should attribute it.
So somewhere in the province of Ontario during 1915 to 1920, there was $3,427 spent on salaries and expenses not otherwise provided for. And you've included it in as part of overhead, and they included it all in.
That's correct.
Almost done.
So now on to slide 159. This is the last one of this detail. So the first the first item, 118, refers to extinguishing squatters' claims and removal of squatters and their effects to other localities. I exclude that because that's not, the squatters aren't paying anything. There's no direct Crown resource revenues. Professors Bodway and Smart include it. And here, I think we've exchanged something in the reports. They include it to say, you need to remove the squatters before you can sell the land. My view is, and that kind of falls more under the administration of justice. If you've already surveyed it and have a claim, you need to enforce that, whether or not you're going to sell the land for timber, for example. 119 is for clearing up the right-of-way and adjacent territory for railways. I don't include those. Again, no direct Crown resource revenues, and it's related to railways.
It's part of the Temiskaming Railway.
That's how Professors Bodway and Smart label it. That's right.
Do you know where the Temiskaming Railway was?
Miscoming?
Yeah, that one.
No, sorry. I believe it's outside of the RST, but the main thing is about clearing railway land, and there's no revenues, and it's in support of the railways. If the railway companies were paying for access, I might have a different. But again, in the matching of revenues, with no Crown resource revenues coming from railways, don't treat any expenses. Line 122, grant to Canadian Mining Institute. Again, this falls under that similar bucket of grants to associations and trade associations, so I exclude it. There's no direct revenue. Some other forestry insurance, line 124, I included as an overhead expense because that presumably helps the whole department. Another larger item, 126. No, 125. My apologies. I skipped a line. The Ontario Nickel Commission. Again, this is a commission. It's not collecting revenues or undertaking those sorts of activities. And so I excluded. Professors Bodway and Smart included.
To be fair, might it be that some of these, this slide 159, it's a snapshot of your data that included not just RST but RHT as well, or because it's Ontario wide, or this is all Ontario wide, so it would include both and also outside of the territory, right?
That's correct. Yeah, all
But-
these numbers are Ontario wide, so it
But
includes.
did you ask the question whether there's nickel in RST? Or did you not even get down to that level?
No, I know it at this moment, as we look back at one of those early mining reporting fees. I mean, that was a relevant consideration, but that wasn't what influenced this. This is really just saying we have the Leach gold mine. There were two examples in RST. So I did consider the different territories, but where this is Ontario as a whole, I have to look at this. I mean, these are all Ontario-wide data. So there's nothing
Right.
specific here to RST.
So you said you have a
RHG.
general reason
Yes,
for excluding it. You didn't need to deal with
that's right.
the
But they would be
territory.
excluded even if the Sudbury was in RST.
One note, of course, on mining in this period, I don't think I showed it on the earlier slides, but RST was a very small amount of Ontario-wide mining. I think we looked at one example where it was 0.7%, and a lot of that was from gold mining. So particularly when it comes to mining, a lot of these numbers are going to be multiplied by very small allocation percentages. For forestry and land, it's going to be more significant.
Okay.
So we have moving expenses, refunds across
You're looking at line 127?
Line 127. Who is moving or to where they're moving is not clear, so I included as an overhead expense. And refunds can capture the whole department, which again might include some gas or other things that are not related, so I exclude those. Okay.
Sorry, refunds, you said you
Oh,
treated as,
sorry, I include as an overhead expense.
right,
because
you
it can-
excluded something from Mr. Bailey or Ms. Bailey.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was related to the soldiers settlement scheme. That was again a scheme, as the name implies. There's different schemes over time to encourage people to settle in Northern Ontario, particularly if they were coming back from the war or something like that. So in this period, that would have been the First World War.
Okay.
We have to capture all the wars. Early on, there was some things for veterans of the Boer War, as an example. Okay, so over the line 131, we have a series of expenses on game and fisheries.
On slide 160?
Yes, sorry, slide 160, line 131. We agree that 1.7 million should be excluded. Neither of us includes direct Crown resource revenues from fishing, so we exclude the game and fisheries expenses. Then there are a few miscellaneous expenses, the biggest one relating to EPCO. I exclude them all. I didn't match them with Professor Budway and Smarts Data, but given we're not looking at the costs of operating HEPCO, that kind of makes sense. So 134 individual line items. On the next slide, slide 161, I try to provide a more perhaps helpful summary by looking at the dollar amounts rather than the individual line items. So in my accounts, I have 12.9 million in Ontario-wide expenses in this period. 2.7 million of that, or $2,678,000, I can't match directly to Professor Bodway and Smarts Data. That's not because they included less than me. That's because of some of the, aggregation might be different. So where I can make an apples to apples comparison of how we both treated the data is this matched line items of 10,224,000. So that's the ones we just went through that had a color next to them. And we agree, at least in part, on about 52% of that dollar value. Back on 47%, we have an identical treatment. So for $4,782,828, we treat them the same way. Or $580,000 worth. We include them, but I only include a portion. I treat them as overhead and they include them in their entirety. That's 6%. There's then 28% of the expenses that they exclude. No, sorry, that I exclude, that they include. Most of that is colonization roads. That's $1,923,924, 19% of the total amount. And then other items I exclude, but they don't. These would be like the investigations, the membership association fees, etc. Forest reserves, that's $947,000 Ontario-wide during this period, or about 9%. Then we have fire, which again gets its own color because we agree for half of the time. We have a different treatment for the other half. And when we have a different treatment of expenses, we also have a different treatment of revenues for 1918, 19, and 20.
Right.
So that's 19%, or $1,987,671.
So what is this? Let's maybe just finish with the blue one.
Sure. That was the two examples, I think, where I included something that they didn't. That's $1,000, $1,400.
So what does the court take from this summary chart after you've taken us through a tour de force of all those line items that are show the granularity you went to? What does this all tell us then in summary?
Yeah, so I would say it's helpful in identifying, two large areas of disagreement. One is colonization roads. That's 19% of the total dollar value, or more than 2/3 of the disagreement, setting aside fire. And then the other is the treatment of fire, which will become more important in later years. This was the kind of transition period. And I'll come back to you now as we start reconciling my analysis with theirs, resource by resource. It's really transportation and forestry related expenses. In forest, fire is a big piece of that. So I don't know how many, I didn't count the number of line items that were pink, that weren't colonization roads. I suppose I could have, but a lot of those were small dollar amounts, as we saw. So I'm just trying to provide a context here of where to focus, where I would suggest focus.
We still have some minutes in the day, and I've got a short section to deal with fire-related expenses, which you've just identified. And I think we have time to just have you explain this issue. Do you think you could?
Sure, happy to.
Is a reporter okay just to continue on? Okay.
So I want to talk a bit more about fire expenses and attribution. So just to recall, I include fire expenses until 1917. In 1917, I stop including fire expenses, and I stop including these different fire, I call them a fire tax, they're different fire levies to recoup some of the expenses from fire, the 30% that's levied on commercial operators. And implicit in that is that the other 70% is related to general government functions. That's difficult to quantify. You don't always know why they bought the water bomber, for example. But I just want to give an example here of why does Ontario tell us they fight fires? So this is slide 163. This is from the Ontario government website on wildland fires. And so they point out that it's an important natural disturbance. However, it can pose a risk to public safety and values such as community, property, timber supply, and infrastructure. They go on to say that the goals of the Wildland Fire Management Program are to prevent loss of human life and injury, prevent and mitigate losses, including economic and social disruption, promote understanding of the ecological role of fire, and to use fire to benefit resource management. So when we think about the costs incurred on fire, these are the benefits on the other side of the ledger. And those costs help support each of these. And within each of these, or within some of these, there may be specific Crown revenue buckets. That's why I focus on what is the piece. And in the early years, it was 30% that the Crown recovered from commercial operators. And then say the rest is funding everything else. The alternative is to attribute 100% of net forest expenses to timber supply.
Fire expenses or forest expenses? Sorry.
Fire expenses, 100% of net fire expenses.
Okay.
And so what happens when you include all of fire as relevant for purposes of the NCRR calculations is effectively saying 100% of the net fire expenses, so after you've subtracted the amount that gets recovered, is attributed to timber supply. And within that, it's all attributable to direct Crown resource revenues. So if we were to think of all the benefits the government might receive, we allocate it all.
You say you have to include a value for all the benefits.
Yes, a value or at least some attribution. Then do the thought experiment. If we stopped charging stumpage charges, for example, we'd probably still have most of the forest fire infrastructure we have, right? Even if we stopped collecting that Fire Protection Act, because, as the Crown has said, there's other values, there's other objectives, human life and injury, property, infrastructure, lots of reasons that we need to fight forest fires. So some amount, no doubt, there's some incremental amount of firefighting related to timber supply for economic benefits, and maybe there's some amount related to direct ground resource revenues. And that's why I use the amount charged through those fire levy type charges as a sort of proxy for that. And say what they're not collecting from those companies, they're getting either through indirect crown resource revenues. You'd asked earlier about, do I include the income taxes or the stumpage charges? No, I was only including the fire specific levies in my 30%. So these other benefits from timber supply, and more generally, these other benefits from community property infrastructure. So that really feeds into how I think about allocating fire expenses. That, again, that cost, which is all the undifferentiated cost bucket, there's at least 3 or 4 benefits on the other side. And here Ontario is telling us there's even more. So that's the reason I take that allocation. And if you don't, that's kind of the same as saying none of that cost was undertaken for protecting communities or property or infrastructure. It doesn't seem to fit with the narrow view of benefits.
Mr. Hutchings, oh, sorry.
So let me try this. Isn't one of the I'm just guessing here, but isn't one of the thoughts that there wouldn't be perhaps communities or infrastructure if you didn't have forestry operations? So you say we could quit charging stumping fees, we'd still have to have fire infrastructure. But if we quit charging stumpage fees, you wouldn't have forestry operations, and perhaps you wouldn't have communities and you wouldn't have other infrastructure. Is that the thinking? I'm asking you to speculate, of course.
No, so I think there are 2 answers to that, if I may. First is, if we just stop charging stumpage, we're still going to have income taxes and other indirect crown resource revenues. So I'm asking a kind of narrower question. If we just gave up the direct crown resource revenues, we'd have no revenues on the ledger.
Okay.
But we'd still have forestry operations, probably. But if you want to rewind the clock, maybe, and say 100 years ago or 150 years ago, we were, for whatever reason, never going to develop forestry industry. We wouldn't just forego the stumpage charges and ground rent and bonus that we calculate. We'd forego all these other benefits as well, the indirect crown benefits and the other economic benefits of the prosperity of maybe fewer people working, less employment, etc. So yeah, had there never been settlement in forested areas or less settlement, I take there might be less fire expense needed. But I would expect the loss on the benefit side would be a lot more than just the lost stumpage. Does that help?
Yes, what you're saying is that I missed, just not charging stumpage fees doesn't mean there's no forestry industry.
Right.
Sorry, Mr. Schachter.
Sorry. I think you have a slide here that tries to, I think, better picture slide 164.
Yes.
Could you,
Oh, do you want me to watch? Sorry.
I want you to go
Perhaps
through
I
slide
failed
164,
to-
because I think slide 164, I think, is a good graphic to explain where you were heading with the allocation.
Yeah.
Or attribution, excuse me.
Sorry, yeah. Slide 164 does kind of say graphically what I was saying in words. I guess I saw it up on the screen, but I forgot to mention I was on 164. So, you can think of how we attribute net fire expenses. If we're saying those are all attributed to just timber supply, those are all attributed to direct ground resource revenues.
So you're not saying that.
No, I'm saying if we were to say that, which
Oh.
is the effect of the method of Professors Bodway and Smart, then we get in this weird hypothetical we were discussing of, well, that's the same as saying none of that expense was undertaken for indirect crown resource revenues, other benefits, etc. So that's why I'm saying I think this is incorrect. I instead assume the commercial operators who, at the end of the day, are paying most of those direct Crown resource revenues, pay their chunk through the fire-specific levies, and the other amounts of fire expenses are distributed amongst all the other general government functions, some of which may be recaptured in indirect Crown resource revenues, as we've been discussing.
So the way that Bodway and Smart then attribute net fire expenditures, they take 100% of the net, they apply it, instead of allocating any of it to the other communities, property or infrastructure or people or safety, they put it all to timber. And then within that timber, you've got a line saying 100% is attributed only to direct Crown resource revenues, but you don't have a line going to indirect or other economic benefits. I just want to make sure I understand that.
That's right. So by including net fire expenses as an expense for purposes of calculating net Crown resource revenues, that expense will be subtracted from only the direct Crown resource revenues we measure. So the first attribution, taking the circle and drawing it just to timber supply, that's not something that Professors Bodway and Smart do in their analysis in words. What they do is they say 100% of net fire expenses are deducted against direct Crown resource revenues. They kind of jump from the left all the way to the right, slide 164. I'm saying the implication of that is that none of the fire expenses are attributed to the other benefits, either indirect revenue benefits, other economic benefits, or some of the social benefits from protecting communities and property and infrastructure. Because if you were going to do a similar analysis we're doing here, say the next thing you asked me to do was, what are the net community benefits? If I've already counted 100% of the fire expenses to timber supply, I've said all of that is on that factory. I can't then double count it and say also have to deduct it if I'm trying to value a community. But if you end up in that framework of saying, well, the fire expenses are also attributable to the community, then you've started double counting. Does that make sense?
Yep.
I think this would be a perfect time to break because we're now going to 1946. And I might say that although it looks like we haven't covered a lot this afternoon, we covered a very, very dense and detailed portion, and I expect tomorrow we'll move a little bit quicker through the slides.
Can you tell me how we are on your time budgeting estimation?
Yeah, I'm thinking right now, if we start at 9 and end at 4 tomorrow, that I will either be finished or I'll be close to finished, maybe half hour to an hour and a half on the third day.
The third day is next week.
Yes.
Got it.
Next Tuesday, yeah.
Okay, I didn't bring the schedule. What was that a plan for the part of that day to be chief?
I don't think, well, I think what happened is that we spoke with our friends, and we figured out that if we bled over into the third day, we would still be okay, because one of them only needed a half a day and another one needed a quarter of a day or something. Between the two of them, a day and a half. Sorry, you want to stand up? Ms. Lewis has spoken to my friends.
Council for Canada advised that they need about half a day, and Council for Ontario, Mr. Hong, advised they needed a day and a half to a day and 3/4. So we should be fine.
Let me think of that. My question is, if we go into the third day, are we ready? Is one party, and whoever's going first, please speak, ready to start their cross-examination on next Monday, I believe.
Tuesday, because Monday's a holiday.
There you go. Tuesday. Is one party ready to start? Because otherwise, well, anyway, I'll just ask that question. Someone ready to start on next Tuesday across?
Ontario will be going first on the cross examinations.
Yes.
We will be ready, and we're hoping to have Mr. Hutchins' chief finish this week if possible, then we could just start fresh, but we will be ready on Tuesday.
Okay, wait, don't go away. You're hoping, but it's clear it won't be finished tomorrow.
Right.
So knowing that, the answer is are you doing the cross-examination? Wait. Are you doing the cross-examination?
I will be starting the cross-examination. There may be some additional issues after.
All right.
Yes.
So you'll be ready to start on Tuesday.
Yes.
Okay. And we might not go to 5, but I don't want to lose an afternoon because it wasn't planned or it wasn't clear. So great, you'll be ready Tuesday. And maybe if we sit late, there'll be a lot less chief next Tuesday. But it just seems to me there is no guarantee that it will be, the chief will be finished tomorrow. Super.
Then that would be all for today. It's close to 5 o'clock.
Very good. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir. These are long, dense days, and I really appreciate, especially our reporter, for pulling through the day since, among other things, we didn't tell her we had a 9 o'clock start. Bad on us. Okay, thank you all. Till tomorrow at 9.
Oh yay, oh yay, oh yay. The sittings of this court are now concluded. Long live the king. Thank you.